Welcome to ReImagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. It's still possible Trump succeeds in his project of authoritarian consolidation. But between the dramatic losses the GOP suffered in the elections earlier this month, the infighting in the conservative coalition, and the Epstein scandal, the prospects for that consolidation are looking more remote. All this makes the "how do we rebuild when Trump is behind us" question feel less like a pipe dream. Which is why I was so happy to see my friends at The Unpopulist launch their new Reconstruction Agenda project, headed by frequent ReImagining Liberty guest Andy Craig. Andy is mapping out what that reconstruction should look like and what reforms present the best opportunities to strengthen and rebuild the institutions of liberal democracy. Joining me today alongside Andy is Shikha Dalmia, founder and editor of The Unpopulist. Before we turn to my conversation with Andy and Shikha, I wanted to let you know there's an easy and free way you can listen to ReImagining Liberty without interruptions from ads and sponsorships. Just head to my Patreon and click join for free. You'll get a special feed you can add to your favorite podcast app that doesn't contain any ads. You'll also get my new essays sent to your inbox. And if you value ReImagining Liberty and want to support the show, there are options for that too. As a supporter, you'll get all new episodes a full week early. To learn more, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Aaron Ross Powell or look for the link in the show notes. With that, here's my discussion with Andy and Shikha. The Unpopulist recently launched a new project called the Reconstruction Agenda, with Andy Craig leading it. Shikha, why don't you start by telling us what this thing is?
So the impetus for this project was that we've got to start thinking about a post-Trump, post-authoritarian world. Trump is not going to live forever, hopefully. And there is going to be a moment when Americans, we are expecting, are going to be tired and exhausted from what this presidency has wrought. And at that point, I think we are going to have a political moment where we as liberals can start taking back the country and rebuilding it in a way that we want. Trump has done so much damage to our institutions, our governing norms, and, just basic civic virtue. No president have done this much institutional destruction as Trump has. And there are two aspects to this destruction. One, he has done something we haven't seen in American politics before at the national level, which is unleash a patrimonial style of governance. And this is something that Jonathan Rauch has written about beautifully. We actually ran a piece by Alan Elrod even before John Rauch wrote an excellent piece in The Atlantic, pointing out what's different about the Trump presidency. And there is a huge aspect to it that he's patrimonial. He wants to concentrate power within himself and the executive branch. And what accompanies a patrimonial style of politics is always and everywhere corruption and cronyism. And you have been seeing that in droves since he got elected. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is that he is engaging in authoritarian consolidation, concentration of power within the branch of the executive for all kinds of reasons, partly corruption, but partly also to advance the MAGA agenda in a way that is completely alien and foreign to the way the American government was conceived. And he's been remaking the presidency in his own image and also for the purpose of sticking it to his opposition, weakening the opposition, preventing it from ever being able to compete electorally on a level playing field. And this is common to authoritarians all over the world. Viktor Orban has done it. Modi has done it. The Law and Justice Party in Poland has done it. They all have the same rule book when it comes to authoritarian consolidation. But what is also very striking about Trump is that he has consolidated more power in 10 months than Orban or Modi did in 8 years. He hit the ground running. He came and he, thanks to Project 2025, had already queued up exactly what he was going to do through executive orders. He has passed something like 250 executive orders in the first 10 months. Obama passed 50 fewer executive orders, and he was considered, in the right wing imagination as the Caesar president, 50 less than what Trump has done. Biden came nowhere close. So we are seeing a concentration of executive power at a scale that we have never experienced in this country ever. Last year, we had launched something called the Fireproofing the Presidency series. And the purpose of that series, and at that time we were somewhat hopeful that Trump wouldn't get reelected, was to start rebuilding the guardrails around the presidency that have eroded for all kinds of reasons that don't have to do with Trump over the last 250 years, but for a lot of reasons that Trump showed us in his, first term in office. The Biden administration had been woefully, and to his eternal shame, neglected the fireproofing of the presidency, and it contributed to the weakening of the guardrails around the office of the executive by all kinds of means. The big student loan forgiveness program, expanding the executive surveillance powers. And our hope was that we would start identifying very concrete ways that were not pie in the sky, that may have been politically difficult, but was still realistic to guardrail a presidency and to prevent future abuses. Trump got reelected. He has unified control of the government, and he is using that to the hilt. So from the first day in his office, he not only decimated whatever few remaining guardrails there were, but actual institutional destruction of the other branches of government. He has completely disregarded the power of the purse. His motto is that if the other branches of government don't stop his illegality or his unconstitutional behavior, he's allowed. And it's a very different mentality. No other president has kind of approached his office in this way. Presidents are elected to take an oath to protect and enforce the Constitution. And Trump's mentality is that unless somebody comes and actually stops him, he'll violate the Constitution. So at this stage, as Jack Goldsmith said at LibCon, we are witnessing literally the dropping of an atomic bomb. He mentioned it in the context of the Department of Justice, but I would expand that to all our institutions. And so we decided at the Unpopulist that not only do we need an agenda for fireproofing the presidency, but we need an entire agenda to reconstruct our institutions and reconstruct the checks and balances in a way that we are not returning to the status quo ante because our institutions had, in fact, ossified, they had, in fact, eroded and weakened, but are stronger and they are not vulnerable to an authoritarian takeover again, and also deliver better governing results so that the appeal of strongman politics is diminished.
Andy, why call this the Reconstruction agenda as opposed to the rebuilding or the reform or the what comes next agenda? Is it an explicit callback to Reconstruction?
Yes, very much so. And I think there's a broader sweep of American history, but the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, it's been called the Second Founding. It was genuinely about a radical overhaul of institutions in the aftermath of their complete failure. The Constitution, as originally designed, had broken down with catastrophic consequences. And when I look to the radical Republicans, men like Thaddeus Stevens, who wrote the 14th Amendment, they were engaged in American self-governance at its best, which is not just we're going to take all these rules and systems for granted. It's kind of up to we the living to design better institutions for the future. And in particular, it was relevant because Reconstruction happened in the aftermath when a large chunk of the country, not the entire country, but a lot of it, had come under a period of constitutional rupture, of illegitimacy. That was always the Union's position. It was Lincoln's position in the war that the Confederacy was not a legitimate government. It was a criminal conspiracy writ large. And I think that's relevant to how we think about what's going on now and the inevitable coming aftermath of it. That this is not just a government that's pursuing various bad policies. This is a systematic attack in a way that is inherently provoking a legitimacy crisis. What's going on now is not something, even if you wanted to, that you could build a stable, ongoing system on. Because it's that kind of patrimonial system, in part, as Shikha mentioned, but also just because it's so incredibly lawless, it's so incredibly one-sided in that it doesn't recognize the idea that these are tactics and tools the other side can legitimately use. Like, it's a very one-way ratchet approach to government and just the chaos in general of all that. So, as we approach that, I think it's important to be thinking about not just the immediate moment, as important as that is, because there's a lot of kind of, constant crisis going on every day, but how we got here and where we are aiming to go and what better systems would look like informs our strategy now. I think it's an essential part of informing what measures we want to take in terms of opposition to the current administration, because what we're trying to get to in the aftermath is going to inevitably color those decisions. We've seen that come up in the fights in Congress. We've seen it come up in the fights in the courts, where that's really a key part of it. It's not just, well, we're against this. It's what are we for? And Reconstruction historically was one such moment, but there have been others. The American founding itself, the original drafting of the Constitution was obviously an exercise in this kind of institutional constitution making. But we've also had, for example, the aftermath of Woodrow Wilson when he went on a insane rampage, probably the worst moment for the First Amendment in American history with the Sedition Acts and throwing dissenters in prison and all that. But there was a moment. I mean, Harding, who's a poorly rated American president in kind of popular imagination, but I think he's maybe a bit underrated because he campaigned on we need normalcy, but then he came in and he pardoned all of Wilson's political opponents. The laws were reformed or allowed to lapse, and there was that kind of moment of backlash. Another important example would be the aftermath of Watergate and Nixon. There was a moment of reform then. A lot of the laws we're talking about now were passed in the mid to late 1970s because of this moment of backlash against the runaway presidency. So we got things like the War Powers Resolution, the Impoundment Control Act. There was the Church Committee that investigated abuses. In all these cases, including Reconstruction, I think there's a warning also in that when that commitment to big overarching institutional reform flagged, there were some pretty bad consequences. We saw after that moment in the 70s, then things started to swing back pretty heavily towards an expanding presidential power. Obviously, Reconstruction failed horrifically in terms of, federal troops were pulled out of the South and half the country was ceded to white supremacist one-party rule for the next century. And, the laws that Wilson abused, a lot of them stayed on the books in ways that later proved problematic and were abused. So these things matter both as kind of the long term, but they also matter for what we're doing right now in this moment. And also, like Shikha mentioned, the man's not immortal. We're seeing the strength of the backlash. I think we are seeing that the effort at authoritarian consolidation will probably ultimately fail, but that could come sooner than even the end of this presidential term. And certainly by then, I think it's realistic to expect. And so we've got to be able to hit the ground running in a way that certainly the Biden administration didn't. A big part of that is the focus on the need for accountability. Yeah, just to briefly tie it back to historical Reconstruction. That's what Section 3 of the 14th Amendment was about. And I don't think it's an accident that seeing that eviscerated, that principle that if you use violence and lawlessness and fraud against the constitutional system, that's breaking the rules in a way that has to get you kicked out of the game. I mean, we've seen examples. I mean, the most notorious example is the rise of the Nazis, but there are many, many others where a political movement is allowed to get away with using violence and also participating in the electoral system at the same time. And that's a path to a very, very dark place, and you can't allow that. So that's one of the things we need to revisit, and there has to be accountability, if not for Trump personally himself at this point, given, he's kind of doddering old man in ill health at this point. But there's a lot of people who have done a lot of very illegal things. And if we're going to reestablish the rule of law, that's one of the things about where our institutions had already weakened and failed even before Trump, is this culture of elite impunity, that you can be in a high office and break laws and violate people's rights and not worry about going to prison for it.
So I have to ask, how quixotic is this quest for, when this is behind us, whenever that happens, here are things that have to happen. So there have to be consequences. People have to go to prison. We have to reform certain institutions. We have to reassert certain norms, et cetera, et cetera. You can make this list and build it all out. And there's value in having that like on the shelf for people to take when they're ready. But the question is, when are they ready? And we're recording this the day after the Senate, or 8 Senate Democrats, caved on the government shutdown. And the way that those senators have been talking, they're like, well, we kind of just had to give up. Like we weren't, we just weren't winning this. We had to give up. And everyone is mad at them. But you look at that, you look at what you talked about, a kind of elite impunity and this culture of there are no consequences for elites, and the experience with the Biden administration where they had an opportunity to bring the law down on a whole bunch of lawless people and they largely did not. What's the likelihood then that we get rid of Trump? He's gone in 2028, say, or January 2029. And there's a kind of, well, like, let's put that behind us. Let's, we are all elites players in a status quo that we don't want to admit has broken and can't come back. We don't want to admit how bad things got. It's kind of messy to be accusing your fellow Americans of horrific acts. Like maybe we get mad at some ICE agents, but for the most part, we'll kind of pretend that these people didn't push for what they did, didn't do the things that they did, weren't as openly fascistic, neo-Nazi as they were. That seems like a pretty plausible scenario, that there's just a, like, we got out of that, it's behind us, it can't happen again, kind of head in the sand again, and no real urge for reform. Like Congress seems to have just given up its like institutional pride. The Supreme Court, it's difficult to know what's going on with it, but it seems to have decided its best role as a junior player to a unitary executive. What's the likelihood that people pay attention, I suppose, to the valuable work that the two of you are doing?
I've thought about that a lot. And what's different about this political moment compared to the previous moments when we had something of a program of institutional rebuilding that Andy mentioned, especially in the 20th century after Woodrow Wilson. And Andy, to your list of Woodrow Wilson and Nixon, I'll also add the FDR presidency, where we passed a constitutional amendment limiting a presidency to 2 terms, which was just a norm till then, right? At all of those moments, there was a bipartisan consensus that we need to do something about the overweening executive. That is particularly the case after Nixon, who wasn't impeached formally because the Republicans in his own party said, you got to go. We are not at that moment right now. We are in a moment of political polarization where there is no hope, as far as I'm concerned, for a MAGA-fied Republican Party to come in and then lead the task of this institutional rebuilding. I think the Republican Party has completely given in to waging the culture wars and winning them by any means necessary, and that requires institutional destruction of the magnitude that we are witnessing right now, which is why the Republican Party is going along with it. On the Democratic side, one of the dangers is that you mentioned that there will be a need to return to normalcy without accountability. And to be completely honest with you, this is something that I think we have to workshop as part of the Reconstruction agenda. To what extent do we want to hold the culprits of these grossest violations of the rule of law accountable? And how do we do it in a way that it doesn't seem like retribution and you are in an endless doom loop of the weaponization of the executive branch to just go after your political opponents? We have to figure out some principled ways of making those distinctions. And that's one of the things that we want to be doing in the Reconstruction Agenda project. But the other reason is I think that the norms and classic prisoner's dilemma logic work when both sides observe them, because they both have something to gain. They both win when they observe norms. When one starts violating norms in the way that Trump has been doing, there's very little incentive for the other side to then obey, because they always will come out losers. And so rebuilding these norms is extremely important, because the inherent logic of this prisoner's dilemma is that the Democrats will come into office and they'll want to profit from the norm and the rule breaking to use these levers of state power for their own advantage. And I am not hearing anything from the Democrats right now that suggests they actually want to rebuild these norms. If you look at the political discourse that is coming out of the Democratic Party right now, it is really about, like, let's try and figure out what the median voter wants, which is basically affordability, and that's a good project. But they're not really taking on the pushback against authoritarianism and rebuilding institutions. That agenda has to be forcefully and aggressively injected in our political discourse.
That's the failure we saw last time. And because of that failure, here we are again. If we just keep going where this is the coin toss that's up at every election between a sclerotic Democratic Party on the one hand and an avowedly anti-constitutional, anti-lowercase d Democratic Party on the other, then the system will inevitably break down in even bigger and worse ways. And the next autocrat who comes along will do even more damage. But the other thing about the scope of possibilities, like what's politically viable and practical, and I do think about that a lot. I think a lot of elite discourse has really underestimated and is missing the strength and increasing radicalization of the backlash against what Trump is doing. This is not like the first term when he was a buffoon. He did a lot of chaotic things, but life more or less went on. We are seeing people being terrified in the streets. We're seeing children being tear gassed. We are seeing what amount to torture camps being run by the United States government through ICE. We are seeing the complete breakdown of the executive branch following congressional appropriations, the power of the purse. And that's the core fundamental bedrock of Anglo-American constitutionalism going back centuries, to the English Civil Wars and before. And once you have all these things in place, in a way, it's been because Trump's second term has been so radical that there is going to be opportunities for radical reform in the backlash. And it will be like all these other examples, like the political desire and appetite for that will fade over time. But that's why it's all the more important to hit the ground running and get as much done as quickly as possible when we have the opportunity.
Yeah, the way I put it is that we need a Project 2029 for liberals and for Reconstruction, where we have an ambitious and radical agenda of constitutional, institutional rebuilding and a reconstruction of civic norms, frankly. And it has to be detailed, it has to be comprehensive. And as you said, Aaron, it has to be on the shelf for people to refer to and pick up and start plugging into their daily discourse and lawmaking and litigation strategies.
My worry in that, and I'd love to pick both of your brains on how concerned you are about this, is what that pent up energy for a backlash looks like in practice. Because you can imagine something like the Russian Revolution, right? Like the kind of final days of the czars, there are a lot of parallels here. And there had been movements for greater liberalism, and those didn't win out. And there's a lot of worry right now that New York just elected a socialist, democratic socialist, but lots of people are very worried about nationalizing the means of production and so on. So I guess, how do we think about liberalism and liberal reforms in that? I was out in the No Kings protest several weeks back. You can see that energy for reform and the anger directed at the state in a way that I certainly have not seen in my lifetime. There was the anger at George W. Bush, but that pales in comparison to what we're seeing now. How worried should we be that this leads to a populist leftist, maybe not as bad as MAGA, but still quite bad from a liberal perspective backlash, instead of a reassert the rule of law, reform the institutions to protect constitutional rights, and kind of get us to something that looks like liberalism backlash?
That's a legitimate fear. We have seen examples of countries, so Russia is certainly one, where there was a right-wing authoritarian period followed by a left-wing authoritarian period, and that's certainly not what we want to have. I think there are reasons for optimism in American context in this current state of the broadly left of center. Could think of it as kind of the broad liberal coalition, which runs all the way from kind of never Trump conservatives, but is certainly predominantly the Democratic Party as we know it, both its left flank and its more moderate flanks. No Kings is a great example. That was all wrapped up in this deep American tradition of liberalism, of the classical liberal heritage of America. It was the Constitution. It was people quoting the Declaration of Independence. It was people casting Trump, quite rightly, as akin to George III and all the grievances against him. There's certainly plenty to criticize about the kind of left flank of the Democratic Party, about people who embrace democratic socialist as a label, even though I would argue they objectively are not actually democratic socialists, kind of as properly defined compared to, their historical and European peers and whatever that actually do fit that label. But there is a danger of a degree of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think this is particularly acute when we look at the thing that might be the biggest flashpoint between our kind of liberals and people more on the farther left, which is going to be about markets and capitalism. And I think it's important to make the kind of liberal case that a market economy is an essential component of a free society. But at the same time, there is a little bit of meat in the middle here. If we look at the current billionaires who have swung behind Trump, figures like Musk and Bezos, and I think we've seen it with Zuckerberg and, all the others you could go on. I think there's a liberal critique point to make that a lot of these concentrations of wealth are artificial, that these have not been purely market driven. There's been a lot of rent seeking. There's been a lot of regulatory capture. There's been a lot of subsidies and various things. And that I think part of our pitch to people who are kind of the more, eat the rich, bring out the guillotines crowd is going to be, look, Yeah, you can go after and kind of retaliate and punish against these guys for what they've done. And many of them do need to be held accountable for things they've done. But if you really want to get to the root of the problem, to get a little bit technical on the economics, you need to address the pre-distribution side, not the redistribution side. If you're leaving in place this system that even from our kind of free market perspective has produced these robber barons is not an unapt comparison. You really need to get to kind of the systemic causes of that instead of just coming in afterwards and say, well, we're going to tax them higher. In a way, it's us offering the more radical reforms. It's about saying that we're going to come in and break the systems that cause this degree of distortion in the market, and that the traditional, more left-wing, bleeding into socialist, progressive, whatever, solutions are actually insufficient to addressing these problems, and that we've got the more important package. But big picture, I do think we're seeing in the strength of this backlash an appreciation that the United States does have this deep cultural strain of classical liberalism, of anti-authoritarianism, of constitutionalism, in a way that not all other countries have been lucky enough to have. We have to play that up. We have to lean into that. We have to own it, that we're the heirs of the party of Lincoln and all these other great liberal reformers that have come along over the centuries and the decades, and really lean into that. And I'm actually pretty confident that we will see things tending more in that direction. And the danger is going to be not one of kind of Hugo Chavez style leftist populism run amok. The bigger danger is going to be exactly what we were talking about, that the support for reform fades, that there's not pushing far enough, hard enough in that moment of opportunity. And that's actually what I worry about more. But it is important. And in my writing and at the Reconstruction agenda, we're not afraid to critique the left when they're going down some rabbit hole that we think is unproductive, or that will in some ways produce even greater concentrations of power to allow a future government to kind of blackmail and coerce all these pillars of private society and civil society and the economy. When you're looking at just kind of giving more arbitrary regulatory and related sorts of powers to the government, I mean, that's power in the executive branch. And there will be a next Republican president at some point, hopefully not elected in 2028, but certainly electoral reform and structural reforms to democracy and trying to get to a more multi-party system are a big part of how the pre-Trump status quo failed and brought us to this moment. So we need to engage with all that. But having said that, I don't expect that, in the aftermath, there won't be a Republican Party anymore. There will be two dominant center-right and center-left parties in pretty much any system. And we have to get to a place where sometimes conservatives can win elections, and it's not the end of the republic.
I completely agree. To buttress the point about how in this way America is different from other countries that are experiencing democratic backsliding, the fact that our, constitutional traditions are much stronger. So they give the resistance movement an automatic, natural, authentic vocabulary to draw on, to craft its case. But beyond that, the way the resistance movement is conducting itself is also very instructive. First of all, Trump is facing far greater resistance than any other authoritarian in any other country. Modi remained intensely popular in India despite his absolutely blunderous policy of demonetization. I mean, the year after that, 9 out of 10 Hindu Indians were still supporting him. The dominant majority in India is a Hindu majority. Orban, no real resistance. And in both these countries, I think the remaking of the institution, the restructuring of the institutions towards authoritarianism has been so fundamental and is so far gone that I don't see it really coming back in those. I think in both these countries, the opposition may win. Especially Hungary is looking pretty promising right now. But I think the idea that we need a reconstruction in these countries is simply going to not materialize. In America, however, if you look at the resistance, you are beginning to see some signs of this congealing on the Democratic side. Gavin Newsom, who hasn't really distinguished himself as the governor of California, and especially there was this moment after Trump got elected that he thought he was going to reach out to the MAGA right in a silly attempt to get some swing MAGA voters, and invited Steve Bannon to his podcast and Charlie Kirk to his podcast and was yucking it up with them. But then ICE descended on Los Angeles and turned it into the war zone that Trump was claiming it was. And suddenly Gavin Newsom found his inner liberal Democrat and made an absolutely brilliant speech calling out Trump's authoritarianism. A similar dynamic is unfolding in Illinois right now, which has become the hub of Trump's worst excesses in terms of militarization of law force and calling in the National Guard, and it's kind of become ground zero for it. And Pritzker has been really good at crafting a case in terms of very American vocabulary against Trump's authoritarianism. But even beyond that, if you look at the response of civic society, now this actually happens in literally no other country. You have groups of just ordinary citizens in states like Illinois, in Chicago, who are getting together and forming a circle of protection around the vulnerable populations. They are providing meals to undocumented immigrants who are holed up in their homes. They have a warning system that they have developed to alert when an ICE raid is coming or ICE agents are floating around. I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm part of this listserv where we are constantly being alerted to the presence of ICE agents. Those kinds of civic responses where the citizens take personal risks for no other reason but because they hate this authoritarianism. For most of these people, there's really nothing in it for them except defending a vulnerable population. And that tradition is extremely strong in America. You saw in Reagan's time when Reagan was denying asylum to people fleeing El Salvador because El Salvador was our partner in the Cold War. Sanctuary churches emerged in this country to give refuge to these people who were hiding. And what this does is it unfolds a certain logic which never really works out well for the authoritarian, which is that the more resistance, principled resistance that you see from ordinary people, the more draconian the state has to get. And when that fight becomes between the resistance and the draconian state, the moral authority is always on the side of the resistance. And I see that dynamic unfolding right now in the United States. One other point to Andy's point, I, like him, do not see a full-blown left-wing populist authoritarian response to Trump right now. There's simply nobody in the Democratic bench who's like that. I don't know, the future Democratic presidential candidates, Pritzker, Newsom, Pete Buttigieg, Jared Polis, Josh Shapiro, seem to be pretty normie presidents. I think maybe if Elizabeth Warren were to get more popular, I might worry about it. But the fact that the right has had to turn Mamdani into this populist boogeyman, and he's running, besides affordability, on an anti-authoritarian agenda, tells you there isn't a deep bench of populist authoritarians on the left right now. Now, that might change. I think eventually, if we don't contain this populist fire on the right, it is just inevitable that the left will find its own populist figure. And we really do have to be vigilant about that and guard against that, which is why I think we are in a race with time over here. We either get this under control, build a principled, constitutional, institutional resistance movement, or we will see some really horrible versions emerge on the left as well in due course.
On the immediate context of Mamdani's win in New York, I think this effort to make him the boogeyman is going to fail in part for reasons that go to the history of the office of mayor of New York. No mayor of New York has gone on to win any other elected office since the 1870s. Mamdani's not eligible to run for president, so, He's going to run for re-election, and we're talking about well into the 2030s. Maybe he runs for governor. Like even if you believe kind of the worst version of what he's going to do, the municipal government issues in New York City are going to be pretty boring and of little interest to the rest of the country. I mean, I just hope he follows through on one Eric Adams policy and gets them to continue adopting garbage bins, catching up with the rest of the country. But maybe they have a little tax increase. You're talking about 1 or 2%. Like the powers this office has and the political perch it has is not equivalent to kind of being the leader of the Democratic Party.
I want to highlight something you said. I think it's really important for thinking about our current moment, and that is the way that ordinary people are responding. Because I think there was this worry and there was an expectation among a lot of more progressive groups, activist groups, people in marginalized communities, that marginalized communities will get abandoned in whatever horrors came down. That those of us who are comfortable, middle class, upper middle class, elites, whatever, we would not be personally impacted, or at least not dramatically, by this. And so we would kind of, elites, whatever, we would not be personally impacted, or at least not dramatically, by this. And so we would let all the other groups, whether that was immigrants or LGBT people or racial minorities, get thrown to the wolves as long as it didn't impact us. And that would have been awful. But I think what I have found extraordinarily heartening in the horrors of the last 10 months is how wrong that turned out to be. How many of the people who are still reasonably comfortable in all of this are making themselves uncomfortable to fight back, are taking real risks. You see, like, the kind of stereotype of these white middle class wine moms who are just going like all John Brown right now. And they don't have to, but they're organizing, they're taking risks. This is extremely important for like the political future of the country, but it also, I think, speaks to the quality of America and Americans. So many Americans have really demonstrated their moral fiber and the quality of their character since Trump took office. And there have been a lot of awful people taking off masks and showing their awfulness, but they seem to be in the decided minority. And I think we all should just take a huge amount of heart in that and hold on to that.
And, I have a cross-cultural perspective on this, right? I am very familiar with India, and I've been speaking out against the authoritarian turn of the Hindu nationalist movement in India. And then I witnessed the same script right here in America with the rise of Trump. And I can just tell you that what is different between India and the United States is that in India, the resistance movement never had the moral high ground. It was all on the Hindu nationalist side. It was all on the side of this grievance politics. It is very different in America. You have grievance side politics, but we still have enough muscle memory of our liberal institutions, our commitment to defend the equal dignity of all, that it is spontaneously emerging up. I can't tell you how many times my Indian friends who grew up in India don't have the same muscle memory as my American friends will advise me to be cautious even in the way I proceed. And I get none of that from my American friends. My Indian friends just want to be cautious because they are self-protective. So this idea of putting yourself out there and defending just abstract rights and and vulnerable communities, I really think that is very, very peculiarly American. And I mean, I don't like to use the term American exceptionalism because, America is not immune to the forces of authoritarianism and cruelty and bigotry and all of that. In that sense, we are like every other people in the world, but we are exceptional because we also have this other strain in our politics where we take certain ideas of justice, equality, and freedom extremely seriously and in a very, very visceral way.
Looking ahead then, to January 2029. What reforms seem the most promising? Amending the Constitution is quite a lift, even in the best of times when things are aligned for you. We're likely to have a fair amount of let's just put this behind us thinking. Are there reforms that say a democratic trifecta can just get done quickly and relatively easily that will have a meaningful impact in strengthening institutions, moving us back in the right direction, and preventing this from happening again?
Yes, there are. And, that's kind of the heart of this project is gaming out what those are and how they're obtainable. I will say on the note of constitutional amendments, a lot of people do write that off as impossible. I'm a little bit more bullish on the prospect of some constitutional amendments because if you look at the history, there tends to be kind of these long dry spells, and then there's a spurt of big reform amendments. There was the Reconstruction amendments. There was the Progressive Era amendments. And so we've seen that, and I do think there are some possible changes in that vein. What could a democratic trifecta do? A lot of that is going to involve there is a deep dissatisfaction with the electoral system, and I think that directly relates to how and why we've had such a disempowered Congress. Congress has lost its legitimacy of a popular mandate because people feel correctly the electoral system is unresponsive and uncompetitive. So there are things that can be done on a statutory basis and also things at the state level that can be adopted. Reforms like proportional representation and having an electoral system where people's voices are more heard, where you have that kind of buy-in of I have a seat at the table, which a lot of people don't have. I mean, not just Democrats while they're out of power, but if you're a Republican in Massachusetts or whatever, you're pretty locked out too. So that's part of it. Another part of it is going to be how do we build within the constitutional constraints systems of accountability and independent oversight within the executive branch? Things like inspectors general, but also things that involve laws you can pass to create causes of action so you can get into court and actually sue over these things and have standing. When you're able to go in and sue the government, that's only because there's a statute allowing it. It's not just the Constitution itself necessarily gives you that right. And so making those things enforceable in expanded ways. There also needs to be a revival of ways of thinking about impeachment. I mean, I think it's very likely we're going to see another impeachment trial after the midterms because Democrats are going to retake the House most likely, and there's going to be an immense groundswell, even if they have to be dragged along into doing it. And so we need to be ready to think about how impeachment can be retooled in ways that makes it a more viable threat. You need 2/3 in the Senate. That's a hard constitutional thing. But there are things you can do to re-empower Congress in its investigatory and oversight abilities and the ways in which the procedures within Congress, the rules have concentrated power in the speakership. One very concrete example is, so right now, Mike Johnson has been doing this thing. They call it district work periods and there's pro forma sessions, but effectively what it amounts to is he's keeping the House out of session and pushing that on and on and on every week where he comes down with it. But that's not a long-standing traditional power of the speaker. I mean, the House meets when the House says it wants to meet constitutionally. And that's been usually how it works is they will go home for a break and they will have passed a resolution that says we're coming back on this day. And the speaker didn't have any power to do anything about it. That changed. It was actually during COVID. It was during Nancy Pelosi's speakership. And it was a well-intentioned practical thing. Like we have this more chaotic situation. We need somebody who can make a little bit more on-the-fly decisions about when and how Congress is coming back. And then that kind of got codified as a permanent rule. But we're seeing how even well-intentioned, mundane administrative powers can be abused in radical, unexpected ways. And so, I mean, that's not even something you have to pass a statute. That's something first thing up. The House, in adopting its rules, needs to rescind that power and also needs to rein in the speaker in lots of ways. And the same thing on the Senate side with the majority leader and his power. So, but I think it's important to recognize that these are not all new ideas we're coming up with. A large part of what this is taking ideas that have already been out there circulating for a long time, that have a fair amount of expert consensus behind them, and putting them on people's agenda as this is the thing we can do. And look, there's all these fleshed out arguments about how it would work, and considering the trade-offs and all those sorts of factors. And I don't think you really see a lot of that actually coming from any other quarter, not even from the progressive left, in terms of we're willing to draw upon the lessons of political science, of the legal academy, of lots of scholarly work that has gone into this. This is going to be a deep cut for our poli-sci nerds, but I have a t-shirt that's a picture of the White House and it says Juan Linz was right. And Juan Linz was the political scientist who really outlined the problems and quantitatively proved that presidential systems are prone to democratic backsliding and authoritarian collapse. So I don't think we're necessarily in the United States going to go completely away. I mean, we're not going to adopt the Westminster system. It's not going to be like an American parliament here. There are historical reasons for that, the structure of federalism and the rest of it. But I do think we can take from that lessons moving in that direction about what would it mean to have an executive branch that was really more executive, that's about implementing the decisions and carrying out the laws, not being the legislative leader. For so long now, it's been that's the role of the president we take for granted, that the president proposes bills and things and tries to get them through Congress. But really, Congress is supposed to be the main partisan, in a not necessarily disparaging way, arena. That's supposed to be where we're supposed to be having these fights about the big policy decisions. It's supposed to be in the representative legislature. And finding ways to retool that balance is really key. So part of what I'm doing is not just my regular essays that we publish at the Unpopulist, but we're really going to both for written pieces and also my Reconstruction Agenda podcast is really bringing in these experts who have thought deeply about these issues and thought about them for a long time in ways that go back before Trump, getting a little bit away from the pundit hot take economy that we're so used to. These figures who are kind of too general in their generalism of their expertise. I mean, I think if you're going to really dig into that point, like I mentioned about the House rules and Johnson, you need somebody who's a congressional procedure nerd who knows the rules. I mean, God, I get into it a little bit, but even I get lost in how bewildering the rules in Congress. In fact, I think a lot of members of Congress don't understand them. Or if we're looking at reforming the courts, you need people who have litigation experience to explain what they would want from their experience doing those kinds of cases. People who are within the Department of Justice who can speak to the norms of non-political interference, the idea that the White House doesn't come in and tell you who to prosecute and who not to prosecute, and can really dig into the weeds on that stuff. So that's kind of the thing I hope the Reconstruction Agenda really brings to the table that's unique, because if we want these things to be on the political agenda, they have to be in a form that's accessible and understood, and where normal average people who don't closely follow all the ins and outs and aren't well versed in all these academic topics can understand and latch on to. So like electoral reform, if you're dissatisfied with the electoral system, you don't necessarily have to understand how droop quotas work and what Duverger's law is and all those kinds of things. You just need somebody credible and trusted who can present, this is the way to reform it. This is the way we avoid this happening again. And that is what really makes it viable, to your question about politicians being able to do it and having the political will to push for these ideas.
Just after Trump got elected, the Unpopulist launched something called Executive Watch, whose purpose was to track the abuses and the weaponization of the executive branch in real time, the institutional decimation that was happening. And the thought behind that was that Trump came ready to flood the zone, and that if we don't keep track of the destruction he is causing, we will actually not even remember what it is that we are supposed to reconstruct or resurrect. And that was the first part of this project, was that we do this tracker, we document every week what's happened that week in terms of executive abuses. We've got it divided into 5 categories of abuse. Very quickly, it's personal grift, political corruption, presidential retribution, power consolidation, policy illegality. Trump is stress testing our system. He's exposing the vulnerabilities in our system that have partly been always there, but partly have emerged because of just the normal course of erosion and degradation. And so we want to be ready to plug these vulnerabilities. And we want to do it in a realistic and thoughtful fashion. And I had mentioned the fireproofing series previously. In the fireproofing series, what we have started doing is workshopping key reforms that both guardrail the presidency and also restore the balance between the presidency and the other branches of government. Congress has given up its legislative powers to the executive a long time ago. And this is something that, actually conservatives had been talking about and had been upset about till Trump came along and they thought, they realized that actually executive power is a great thing. And a part of that series, we identified, very concrete practical reforms for which we can get bipartisan consensus. Fixing the Insurrection Act, taking away the vast sweeping emergency powers that the presidency has been granting, having a federal anti-SLAPP law, limiting the surveillance powers of the executive. And we are documenting and developing these ideas in the hope of building a bipartisan consensus when the moment is right.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of ReImagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.